Joining me now is Evan Mandery. He is a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and an expert in the death penalty. And Professor Mandery, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Tina. I'm happy to be here with you.
Well, all right, this is a much awaited decision, even though the time jurors just began deliberating the end of last week. That in itself, when we talk about them not being able to reach a unanimous decision, which would then say that Sayfullo Saipov would get the death penalty. They told the judge, we are not able to reach a unanimous decision. Are you surprised?
I'm not surprised based on the questions that they submitted last week. So they asked two questions at the end of the week, one of which was about a federal moratorium on executions and whether or not there was a valid federal protocol. And I thought those questions suggested that there was at least one juror in the room who was unusually knowledgeable and minimally predisposed against the death penalty.
The fact that when we hear a judge finds out that they cannot make a verdict, the judge does have the option to say, Alan charge. I want you to go back and see if you can come up with all the same decision. Did it surprise you it didn't go there?
Well, that's right. I mean, so they can. I mean, in a criminal case, in the guilt phase, it would be common for the jury, for the judge to send the jury back to continued deliberations. This is a little bit different since this is the penalty phase of a death penalty trial where guilt has already been determined. I'm not entirely surprised because if there is a juror who's voting no, then that dictates that isn't exactly like a hung jury. That dictates that there's not a death sentence, that it's life without parole. So I actually thought the judge's decision was correct.
Let's go back a bit because we are talking about, as you said, this is unusual. I mean, this is a federal case, the Southern District of New York, because of the capital crimes, this Southern District can go for the death penalty. So here we have this case held over from Barr days under President Trump with Bill Barr as the AG into President Biden's administration, of which, as you said, there's the moratorium. So there were just so many different factors here that made this unusual. Did you have an expectation beforehand that this could have gone the way of the death penalty?
Well, I certainly just affirm that you're right, that there's a lot of kind of procedural oddities here, right? So the context is you're in a state where the New York Court of Appeals has abolished the death penalty. And for the most part, Merrick Garland has declined to continue to prosecute carryover cases from the Barr Trump administration. So this is one of a handful of cases that have gone to trial. Did I think that there could be a death sentence? I mean, the prosecutor wouldn't seek the death penalty if they didn't think that they had a significant chance. And this is definitely a highly aggravated case. And the absence of remorse and the behavior in prison, it wasn't inconceivable that there would be a death sentence, though it was extremely unlikely, even if there was a death sentence, that he ever would have been executed.
Going to with the prosecution talking about the threats that Saipov has made in prison so far, and as you say, saying a threat, let alone could he have escaped or other types of situations. Then the defense saying, but wait, don't meet death with death. It's, I don't know, I'm trying to get in jurors' heads. Of course, we cannot do that, but as a more broad figure thinking about this moral decisions and the justice, what is justice, right? I mean,
I think you're thinking about
or the
it.
deterrent is the death penalty a deterrent or not?
I think you're kind of the way you're thinking about it, like it's just complex. I mean, and in fact, I teach this stuff all the time, right? And kind of the question that you're asking a juror to answer is presuming that you're open-minded about the death penalty. Is this an appropriate case for it? And I'm not really a supporter of the death penalty, but if you asked me in sort of a ranking of crimes, is this one that you would be eligible? I'd be like, well, this is pretty bad. And certainly if you were, the parents of one of the victims, you would feel that way. So, you know, as a policy matter, I don't think the death penalty deters, and I think there are lots of problems with bias and selectivity in its administration. But I don't think it's insane for the prosecution to have sought the death penalty, given that it exists.
And again, Sayfullo Saipov, Halloween 2017, rented a truck, a U-Haul truck at a Home Depot in Passaic County, New Jersey, drove over the George Washington Bridge, headed down the West Side Highway, somewhere along just before Houston, gets on the bike path there, which we know is just so popular and a beautiful ride or walk. And yeah, right. And 8 people, 5 of them from Argentina, 1 a Belgian tourist, and then 2 others, 1 a Manhattan man and 1 a New Jersey man who worked in Manhattan. Just back to the human lives of all of this, and the biggest tragedy involving terrorism since 9/11.
I'm glad you say that, because I think when we do sort of legal analysis and news analysis, it's easy to forget that there are human beings who were victimized by this. And I'm with you. I used to run on that path all the time, and it's a beautiful place. And it's all of these crimes are tragic, but my heart goes out to all of those families.
Yeah. And lastly, Professor, you're looking at federal history, looking at New York State history, and the back and forth and the changing of the minds. You mentioned New York State, Pataki, and then Pataki, yes, right, 1995 or 6 for the death penalty, and then changed by Patterson.
Pataki won that election as a pro-death.
Right.
Cuomo lost because of the death penalty.
Right. And then Andrew Cuomo then getting rid of the chair. When was that? Just a few years ago.
The New York in New York, it actually was abolished by the court system.
Okay.
So the New York Court of Appeals had ruled it unconstitutional under the state constitution, and then during the Cuomo administration, they basically made a formal decision not to try to fix the problems with it. Yeah.
So my question then, and as a professor and speaking to the lawyers of tomorrow, and today, I'm sure, where do you see the death penalty on different levels in 20 years, 50 years?
Well, the death penalty in the United States will end. It's pretty, if cruel and unusual punishments mean anything, it's hard to imagine that you could continue to defend that. And the death penalty as practiced in the United States has basically been reserved for a handful of poor people of color. So it's not that we, pick terrorists or the worst criminals and choose them for execution. At the state level, it's just really for poor minorities. So it's impossible to defend. But if you'd asked me this question 5 to 10 years ago, I would have said I thought that the Supreme Court would end it. Clearly, this Supreme Court will not end it. And, in the United States, it doesn't even really make sense to talk about the death penalty. Like, there are just a handful of states, mostly Texas, that continue to practice it. And, the question is, will the U.S. Supreme Court ever drag Texas into modern times? But executions are dramatically reduced. I mean, there were only a couple of dozen of executions in the United States last year. So it's clearly on the way out. It's just a question of time.
All right, Professor Evan Mandery, John Jay College, criminal justice, the Department of Criminal Justice, and an expert on the death penalty. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Dana.